Good afternoon, all. I have good news and bad news. I am pleased to introduce our dear Schemel speaker, Trudy Rubin, to you. However, she will be with us remotely. Though we would like to have her here in person, her remote presence gives us the opportunity to hear about her conversation with the Ukrainian ambassador that took place just an hour ago. That meeting is why she couldn't be with us in person. When we book one of our nation's finest WorldView columnists, we realize that she is on call every minute of every day. How lucky are we that Trudy will be with us just minutes after her meeting with the Ukrainian ambassador here in the States. And so we will be that close to knowing what is going on in Ukraine right now. It really doesn't get better than that. Putin's invasion of Ukraine was a hapless cruelty born out of contempt for a democracy and a democracy leaning country that he would like to own. He sometimes thinks he does own it. Putin fancies himself a czar, rebuilding the Russian Empire. Meantime, much to his embarrassment, the Ukrainians have risen to the occasion. His bloody, murderous warfare with strength and boldness, ready and able to stop Russia from overtaking their country. Please welcome Trudy Rubin to the remote podium to fill us in on Ukraine's noble effort to stave off the Russians. Trudy?
Hello. Sorry, I can't. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, I can't be with you in person. I had been trying to get the Ukrainian ambassador for an interview on Inquirer Live webinars that I do, and she finally responded. And what was the only date in December she could do it? Yes, today. So I just got through with our discussion. So I'll tell you a little bit about that. And I want to talk about my 2 trips to Ukraine this year and where I think things are going from here with that painful conflict. And of course, I will talk about the meeting between President Biden and President Macron yesterday, in which Ukraine featured heavily. I think if I were going to summarize my meeting with Ambassador Makarova, who's a very interesting woman, besides being now ambassador to the US, she was finance minister for 5 years before that, and in private equity. So she has a good idea of how long it's going to take and how hard it's going to be to rebuild Ukraine, although we didn't have time to get into that very deeply. But if I were going to summarize one point from that discussion, and I think it's an important point for any discussion of the war, Russia's unprovoked war in Ukraine at this point, it's that Ukrainians will not refuse to give up before they win. And I asked her to define winning, and she defined it as President Zelensky does, with either driving out or succeeding in getting the Russians to pull out from all of Ukrainian territory. That might have seemed impossible a few months ago, or on March 25th, say. The invasion was February 24th. And as you know, hit heavily around the entire country. But that is a point that Ukrainians make over and over now. And even if it can sometimes look impossible when you look at the map of what Russia still occupies, which is close to 20% of the country, if you include Crimea, they are adamant on it. And it is not just posturing. And that is one of the things that I find the most amazing and the most telling about dealing with Ukraine and visiting in person. Just to backtrack a little bit, I was in Ukraine on my first trip this year for a couple of weeks just before the war started. So I knew, or I surmised, that the war would not start before the end of the Beijing Olympics, because when Putin met with Xi Jinping, it was clear that the Chinese leader didn't want the focus on his Olympics to be disturbed in any way. So I wanted to see the country before the war started. And I also went to Lithuania. And I am so glad I did that, because I was able to spend time in Mariupol. And I will tell you, from somebody who saw this absolutely lovely city, who talked to the secretary of the city council, which is an administrative post, and heard about all the development plans, the enhanced investment in hospitals, universities, developing Mariupol as a tourist city, building a new marina. And I saw all of this, plus the steel mills, which famously you saw where the defenders of the steel mills held out for months. To see that city then, to stand in front of the famous and now infamous drama theater, where 600 civilians hid in the basement and were deliberately bombed by planes overhead who could read the big words spelled out on the pavement in front of the theater and in back, Deti, which means children. If you saw that before that city was turned into rubble, you can understand why the Ukrainians believe this is an existential fight. So I was glad that I saw it then. But let me elaborate a little more on why this fight is existential to Kiev and to the citizens of Ukraine, and why I believe that the Allies are finally coming around to understand that, and to understand why Western countries cannot simply enable Ukraine to survive. They must help it win, because the Ukrainians will not stop fighting. They feel that it is a choice between that and basically being wiped out by Russia. When I came to Ukraine in February, and I spent time in Kiev, in Odessa, and in Mariupol, nobody that I spoke to thought there was going to be a massive invasion covering the whole country. I'm not even sure Putin thought that. In fact, I think he didn't think that. The assumption was, as became clear, that the Russians thought they could come in, send hit teams into Kiev, take out Zelensky, who Putin believed was a clown. That was his words. And basically put a puppet government in, and then put more troops in and control the country as a fiefdom, as a colonial outpost, not as a real country. And clearly what they had in mind under that kind of a puppet regime was to push out the Ukrainian language, to cut contacts, economic and military, with the West, and to suppress any resistance to that kind of puppet regime. This kind of thinking goes back to the 1940s and the Yalta Agreement between Stalin, Churchill, and FDR, when spheres of influence were set up, which carved up Europe between Soviet dominance and US dominance. It surprises me when I read arguments from so-called progressives in the United States and from realists that want to recreate this. They are lost in almost a century ago history. The world has changed. Countries have agency, especially in Eastern Europe. They remember what it was like to live under Soviet rule, which Putin is trying to recreate. And they are unwilling to go back there. They have left that. And these countries are not simply puppets and don't want to return to puppetry. I don't think that Putin understands that at all. As you probably know, he has described the breakup of the Soviet Union as the greatest tragedy in the 20th century. And while he does not want to recreate the Soviet Union, he wants to recreate a Russian empire, which looks like the Soviet Union territorially, where Russia either absorbs countries like Ukraine, which Putin is obsessed with, and Belarus, or else dominates the way the Soviets used to dominate the Warsaw Pact countries. This is history. It cannot be resurrected. And of course, Putin has distorted the historic relations between Russia and Ukraine, insisting that Ukraine is not a country and that it was created by Russia, and that Ukrainians and Russians are one people, and Ukrainians are part of the Russian people that have gone rogue. So I came back to Ukraine in July and really traveled all over the country. I was in Kiev, Kharkiv, before Ukraine took back the whole area around Kharkiv. I was in Odessa, which at that point was blockaded by the Russians, and the grain deal was being worked out at that point. And I'll say something about that in a minute. And I was in Mykolaiv, which was the most forward position in the south, in the battle to retake Kherson, which, as you know, just succeeded, however many, a couple of weeks ago. By that time, the existential nature of this war was already crystal clear to Ukrainians. I drove through Bucha, Irpin, Hostomel, Borodyanka, these infamous suburbs, ex-urban towns, this Trail of Tears that was occupied by the Russians, and then the Russians were driven out early in the war and unexpectedly by an incredibly resilient Ukrainian army. What was so moving to me at the time was two things. This was before those areas were liberated. No, I'm confusing myself. I saw them before liberation. What impressed me in July so much was that this war was a total group effort of civilians and military. When I had been there in February, I saw civilians training to joint territorial forces, which were like reserve units. You saw accountants, you saw housewives. Everybody wanted to fight. Nobody expected it to be a war like they confronted, but everybody who was mobile and wasn't bogged down with working to support the family, being too old, or having to take care of children, wanted to get into defending the country. When it turned out that the Ukrainians succeeded in pushing the Russians back from around Kiev, and then Putin mobilized and sent his whole army virtually into taking over parts of Ukraine, that kind of insistence on helping grew and grew and grew. Before I came back in July, I used to talk to people on cell phones. You could get through to Army units. The only thing we can thank Elon Musk for is sending Starlinks, which enabled troops and to communicate via satellite. I was talking to people in the front, former journalists, former IT workers that I knew. They had no previous military experience, and they had joined up and joined territorial defense units that were then mobilized in full bore into the military. And they were risking their lives because they knew that it was us or the Russians. By the time I came in July, you could see what the Russians did in the places that they occupied. We all saw the bodies on the road in Bucha, but the viciousness extends to everywhere that the Russians came into, and we could see after they left. I went to a city called Chernihiv, which the Russians surrounded for 40 days, but were finally pushed back from. It's not far from the Russian border. Again, this was a beautiful historic city, a tourist destination, full of IT workers who worked for Western multinationals, including some in Philadelphia, who had to move all their workers out to Poland. And the Russian goal is to gut a place. They fired at hospitals, they fired at schools. And when they were finally pushed out, I drove along the road where there were villages, and Ukrainian villages, people live in small bungalow houses with gardens and plots of vegetables. And every house in these villages, as the Russians withdrew, was deliberately targeted and their roof blown off or their windows knocked out. Just viciousness. So, and you have seen the satellite photos of Mariupol. My translator came out alive from Mariupol. And again, it's the vicious targeting of apartment blocks, total indifference to civilian life. I saw this in Kharkiv when I went. Kharkiv is a beautiful city that reminds you of Philadelphia. It has a river walk, parks along the river, playgrounds, cultural life, theaters, and in the north of the city, beautiful newish apartment blocks with modern malls. Apartment block after apartment block simply ripped apart. Malls, I stood in a multiplex that had been targeted, fortunately, no people in it. Imagine if you were in the AMC multiplex, well, you're not in Philly, but I'm sure there's one near you in a mall, and you're standing in one of these modern movie theaters and everything is cinders. This is the Russians' approach to war. Now, I want to say a bit about what the Russians claim was their reason for going into Ukraine. You know, it has kept changing. Initially, it was that the Ukrainians are Nazis and Ukraine had to be denazified, and that the Ukrainians were oppressing people who spoke the Russian language in the East. Let me say a word about those two claims, which are still made on state-controlled TV and propaganda in Moscow. First of all, Ukraine repressing the Russian language. I mentioned that I was in Kharkiv, a city that used to be 1.5 million and is near the Russian border, about 30 miles in the north. All the territory around Kharkiv is now liberated. That is a Russian-speaking city. It is a city famed for deep roots in Russian culture and Ukrainian culture. The Russians, this year dropped missiles on most of the high schools there. The son of a friend showed me where the bomb fell on his high school, is right where they used to take Russian language classes. Of course, it destroyed most of the school. They sent missiles into university faculties. Kharkiv has Ukraine's most famous big universities. Russian language wasn't repressed there. The same in Odessa. They all speak Russian. Nobody repressed them. This is simply a canard. On the contrary, in the cities that Russia has occupied, they have repressed the Ukrainian language. What about the charge that Ukrainians are Nazis? I was surprised when I went to dinner at a friend's house here in Philly that her husband, who was a retired noted doctor, had spoken with friends in Northeast Philadelphia, which is heavily Russian Jews who emigrated in the 80s and the 90s. And some of the older folks still watch Russian TV, which is horrific propaganda. I was surprised that my friend's husband thought that Ukraine was run by Nazis, despite the fact that it has a Jewish president and a Jewish prime minister. That is ancient history. Ukraine was never run by Nazis, but during World War II, in order to fight the Soviets, Ukrainian nationalists joined with the Nazis. And it is absolutely true that many Ukrainian nationalists joined in murder of Jews. This is true. In the years after the war, many under Soviet rule, many young Ukrainians celebrated the birthday of the leading Ukrainian nationalist who fought with the Nazis against the Soviets. And those kind of celebrations did occur in the west of Ukraine, which used to be Poland, until the mid-2000 teens. In 2014, Putin invaded Ukraine for the first time in the east and annexed Crimea in the south and in the east, parts of the Donbass region, which you've heard about. That was the end of any celebrations of anything that harked back to World War II. At that point, Ukrainians became totally focused on the repression from Russia. And at that point, they had pushed out a pro-Russian president. At that point, you had leading Jews in the Jewish Ukrainians in the movement that pushed out the pro-Russian. You had Jewish young people leading the movement in the Maidan, the uprising. You had a totally different group in the forefront of Ukraine. You had Jewish intellectuals leading the defense forces in Odessa, in Kharkiv, in Donetsk, the city that Russia ultimately took over. People don't realize that there has been a generational change in Ukraine. Jews are an integral and active part of the younger leadership cadre and business establishments. And you now have a Jewish president and the second Jewish prime minister. There was one previously, about 5 years ago. And the idea, which is still prevalent in some areas of Jewish society in the United States, that Nazis are in the forefront in Ukraine is ludicrous. In fact, the far right in Ukraine gets less than 1% of the vote and has no seats in the parliament. I still remember when I went to Odessa in 2014, and I went again this time and spoke with the chief rabbi. And I asked him about anti-Semitism in Ukraine. And he said to me, oh, there's anti-Semites here, there's anti-Semites everywhere. He said, but right now there's far more anti-Semitism in Russia, and anti-Semitism is not what anyone here cares about. What they care about is Russian repression. Back in 2014, there were Russian spies Ukrainians who were close to Russia. There was a lot of KGB left in Ukraine, Ukrainians who were in the KGB. After the Soviet Union broke up, they faded into the woodwork. But when Putin wanted to take over Ukraine, Moscow called on them. And he told me that there had been provocations with swastikas painted on stones in the Jewish cemetery. He said he called up the local chapter of a group called Pravi Sector, which is a right-wing group that has no influence at all in Ukraine now, but it still had a little chapter in Odessa. He said, "Did you guys do it?" And the head of it said, "No, it wasn't us. What can we do?" And the rabbi said, "Send somebody to clean up our cemetery." And I have a photo, which the Inquirer published at the time, of a bearded rabbi standing, looking down at somebody wearing a sort of brown shirt, who's scrubbing the swastikas off of Jewish headstones. In other words, Putin's claim that Nazis and Pravi Sector run Ukraine is as ludicrous as the rest of his lies. And fast forward to now, you have Ukraine fighting this incredible war. And when I said that the war engaged the entire population, let me tell you more of what I mean. Inside Ukraine, in cities, every young civilian, maybe not every, but incredible numbers of civilians, young and old, who are not actually in the military, are using whatever spare time they have to work to get food to the needy, including in areas under shelling, to get supplies to military units of their friends and family, which often still don't have what they need, to rebuild even as the war continues. When I was in Ukraine in July, I went out with one of these groups that actually is funded in part by Ukrainian Americans. Two guys founded this organization called Ukraine Trust Chain. One of the leaders is in Philadelphia, the other in Chicago. These were two men who went to elementary school together when they were 10 years old in Kiev, in a Jewish school, emigrated. One is in IT, one works for UPenn. And if they formed an organization which finds point people, volunteers in Ukrainian cities who set up networks. I went out with one of the point people, Ksenia Columnist, and some people from her network. And what did we do? We went to a village not far from Bucha, where the school had been destroyed. These young people were taking measurements, were bringing in carpenters that they knew, were using money from Ukraine Trust Chain to repair windows, doors, and a hole in the roof so that the school could start by fall. As soon as the war started, the same young woman, Ksenia Kalmus, who has an MBA and was running a successful floral business, changed her store into a depot for food, and volunteers would bring supplies. She teamed up with restaurants, which weren't working at the beginning of the war, that started cooking meals. And then they brought packaged meals deep down into the subway where people were taking shelter at the time from Russian shelling. This is the kind of repair and aid work that is going on all over Ukraine. Right now, those volunteers are bringing food into Kherson, the newly liberated city in the south that got so much attention a couple of weeks ago, which now Russia is shelling the survivors there. This is a country that is fully engaged. When I talked to wounded soldiers, all they wanted to do was to go back to the front. I spoke with one wounded soldier in Philadelphia who was being fitted here for prosthetics. He was one of the defenders of Mariupol in the steelworks, was taken prisoner of war. He had lost a leg and an arm. In the hospital, a man with one leg and one arm was tortured by Russians. They stuck screwdrivers into his ankle. I saw the scars. They extinguished cigarettes on him. They gave him electric shock. A man who had lost a leg and an arm. And they left him to rot without antibiotics, without painkillers, without an IV. Sepsis set in. He was on the verge of death when the second prisoner exchange occurred between the Russians and the Ukrainian army. And for some reason, the hospital he was in, he was sent to the prisoner exchange and his life was saved. All he wants to do is to go back and fight now that he has prosthetics. This is the mood in the country. Now, granted, we are now in winter, and as everybody sees, it is harder to fight in winter. The Russians are dug in. But when I was talking to the ambassador, she is insisting there is no way the Ukrainians are going to stop. They will fight as long as it takes. Now, of course, the question is, will the West and the United States stand alongside Ukraine as long as it takes to drive Russia out? The West is starting to get the message that they are part of this war because the Ukrainians are fighting a war that America cannot afford to lose, nor can the Ukrainians afford to lose, because Putin has proven himself to be a despot with imperial ambitions who cannot be allowed to win. The question is, will we give Ukraine the support that they need, not just to survive, but to win? There was a meeting of NATO foreign ministers just this week on the 29th of November, in which the Ukrainian foreign minister said, it's not enough to give us generators, because that's what the NATO foreign ministers were discussing, trying to revive the electric system that has been shattered by Russian missiles in an effort to freeze and starve Ukrainians this winter into giving up. What Kuleba said is, if you give us Patriot missiles, which are air defenses, you won't need to keep giving us generators because we'll be able to prevent those missiles from destroying our civilian infrastructure. Late in the day, I think the Allies are only now beginning to get it. It took until July for them to start to get it. In July, during the 3 weeks when I was there, the whole nature of the war changed. Why? Because just before I arrived, the United States finally sent HIMARS weapons, which are anti-missile weapons with a 50-kilometer range. They're missile systems with a 50-kilometer range, which enabled the Ukrainians to pinpoint attack Russian missile depots. It changed the entire nature of the war. We have sent them 16 HIMARS systems. We have a lot more in storage. But if we had sent those HIMARS in March, maybe the war would have been nearly over now. We finally sent the HIMARS, but we didn't send the air defenses that Ukraine needed to keep Russia from destroying their civilian architecture. Now, NATO countries are scrambling to ante up sophisticated missile defense systems. Germany has sent a couple. They're going to send a couple more. The United States has sent a couple. They were going to send more in 2 years. In 2 years, now they are pressing other countries to who they have sent these NASAM systems to loan them or give them to Ukraine, and the US will produce more over the next 2 years and backfill for the countries that coughed them up. We are still not sending Patriots, our best, almost best, we're moving beyond Patriots now, system. We claim to have shortages, but we have sent them to 13 other countries. Why couldn't we do the same? Ask them to loan them to Ukraine or give, and we backfill. Those are the best systems. Those are what Foreign Minister Kuleba says they need to close the skies. From the very beginning, Zelensky begged, help us close the skies. We're finally getting there. Ukraine has proven that it can adapt to Western weapons, that it can innovate with Western weapons, that it can create new systems by blending Western weapons with the old Soviet weapons that are most of what it had before this war. They are innovative. They are tech savvy. They are amazing, the American military. If they were in NATO now, which they're not, of course, and probably won't be, they would be probably the most sophisticated army in NATO next to the United States. So the question now is, and I'm leaving out a lot and I'm going to stop for your questions. The question now is, will NATO and the West understand that they have to enable Ukraine to drive out the Russians? Putin has proven that he's good at threats, but doesn't carry through if the West stands up to him. He threatened nukes and threatened nukes and threatened nukes. And Biden sent the head of the CIA, Bill Burns, twice to meet with Russian counterparts. Had Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, meet with a counterpart. And a clear message was given to the Russians, don't you dare. When the message is clear, Putin pulls back. And Putin knows that using a tactical nuke, it will gain him nothing on the battlefield and will not stop the Ukrainian advance. It will just gain him opprobrium on the world stage, and both the leaders of China and India have warned against Russia doing that, and Russia cannot afford to alienate China and India, who now import most of its energy exports. So Putin can be stopped, and the question is whether we now understand he must be stopped and give Ukraine the weapons it needs to stop him and push him out. Otherwise, this war could drag on. And with a new Congress, with more MAGA Republicans, there could be challenges to aid to Ukraine. The ambassador said she doesn't worry about that because she believes that, and her country believes, that there is still a strong majority, both in the US and in the Congress, for aid to Ukraine, and that it will continue. In my mind, the operative question is, will we finally realize with Patriots and all of the sophisticated weapons Ukraine is asking for, that Ukraine can win and we should help them win? So I'm going to stop now and take questions.
The soft underbelly of the Russian offensive, I think, from everything that I've read and heard, is its ability to continue to finance the war through its selling of energy supplies to the West. To what extent have you been able to find out the efforts the United States is making to attack Russia on that front, to undermine its financial ability to keep the war going, quite apart from the military ability?
I think, on the financial side, there is a lot of analysis that the economic cost of sanctions is now kicking in, being felt more and more in Russia. But Putin is not really interested in the cost to the economy over time. I mean, he, I believe, knows that if he loses this war, his political future is dim. And so he will let the public absorb the cost. So far, sanctions haven't really changed his behavior, even though they're going to have a long-term negative effect on the economy, which is being felt more and more now, including technology development in the future, including weapons development, and including growth. As you've probably seen, the allies, the EU and the US are trying to put a cap on oil prices, meaning that no Western country will insure or ship Russian oil unless it's sold at below that cap. But as a matter of fact, oil prices are going down in large part because China's economy is in a tailspin. And so the cap won't hurt much more than Russia's being hurt right now. And the US can't stop oil and gas sales to China and India. So Russia will still have income. I think what is especially important right now is to stop Russia from rebuilding its arsenal with imports from outside, because Russia is running short of missiles. And even with the famous call-up that Putin instituted, it's a lot of untrained people, who will take a serious amount of time to be able to really fight well, especially when morale is low in the Russian military. So the real issue is weaponry, Russians being able to resupply. The manpower is weak, but we see they can keep lobbing missiles and destroying civilian infrastructure. And they can keep shelling Ukrainians in the trenches, because there's a lot of trench warfare going on now. Both Iran and North Korea are already sending weapons and are supposedly getting ready to send missiles. The Iranians, as you know, have been sending drones, armed drones. Turkey has also been doing a lot of trade with Russia, not necessarily in weapons. I think the most critical thing now is for the US to figure out how to stop the shipment of those weapons. I think the attempt to negotiate a new nuclear deal with Iran is dead, and there should be more sanctions and every effort made to stop the transport of those weapons from Iran and from North Korea. And also, frankly, as Foreign Minister Kuleba said, if we would give the necessary air defenses to Ukraine, right now, Russia is losing on the land. And if Ukraine could block those missiles, they would be in a much better position to withstand the Russians and while they keep moving forward on the ground. So, I think it's a combination. Russia will be hurt deeply in the future. But I think the critical time for Ukraine is within the next 6 months, when the manpower is hurting, weak, and low in morale. We should want this war finished as soon as possible for the benefit, obviously, of Ukraine, of Europe, and the United States as well.
Thank you.
Sandra, did you have a question?
Have you ever seen anything like this in your professional life, that this black and white, this it's almost like a story, a fiction story, where there's such clarity of nobility with the Ukrainians and darkness. It just seems to be a model that's fortunately not seen often.
I have been asked about how this compares with other wars that I've covered. And yes, this is unique for me. I have to say that the wars that I have covered before, in Lebanon, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, have been a totally different kind of conflict. In all of them, they were in countries that were racked by internal civil war, by factional war, by religious war internally. So U.S. involvement, came up against in Iraq and Afghanistan, and Israeli involvement in Lebanon. They all came up against the fact that they had no idea how to operate in a situation where there was no central government or central force that was fighting against another central force. It was multi-pronged and vicious conflict. So, I've seen horrible crimes and destroyed buildings before, but in a totally different kind of environment. What you have in Ukraine, which is so different, is, Ukraine is a European country, basically. Its cities look like our cities with a lot more historic buildings. So maybe more like European cities. Highly educated population. Yes, there's a lot of countryside that, you still think peasants. As I said, bungalow houses, people have livestock, people have farm plots. But this was a country that wanted to trade with the West. This was a country that had strong exports in grain, in steel. This was a country that, while it had a lot of corruption left over from the Soviet era, was trying to move more towards Europe, which Putin did not want, even in an economic sense. So to see cities that look like ours being bombed into rubble, you feel like you've been transported back to the Blitz, in 1940 London. That's what's so incomprehensible, especially when it's not two countries fighting against each other. Putin claims now that that it's NATO fighting this war. The fact is that before Putin invaded for the first time in Ukraine, I remember I was there then. The public opinion was against joining NATO. Only 11% of the public wanted to join NATO at that time. Putin created hatred where there was fondness for Russia in many parts of Ukraine. And already then in 2014, it was clearly an imperial war. Russia publicly wanted to take the whole swath of territory in the east and south all along the Sea of Azov, the Black Sea coast, much of which it has now, and it wanted to go further and take Odessa, which would have left Ukraine as an economic basket case. It would still leave Ukraine as an economic basket case. At that time, Russia didn't do it because the populations of those Russian-speaking cities in the south were clearly opposed. Russia sent spies and provocateurs in trying to provoke pro-Russian demonstrations, and they failed because in Mariupol they failed, in Odessa they failed, because even in Russian-speaking areas which were not fond of the government in Kiev, they didn't want Moscow back. And so what's so astonishing is to see this carnage on the ground, to see a young woman who just got a BA in English and was about to start teaching and had cluster munitions dropped on her in a bus stop. And her father, who was walking the dog with her near the bus stop, is dead. And she's lying in shock with her mother looking like she's going to die beside her in the intensive care unit.
Yeah, bombing.
Yes.
Hospitals.
So it is a war being fought by someone, Putin, who thinks that it is still the 1940s and wants to divide up Europe between Moscow and Washington in a new Yalta agreement, as if the countries to be divided up have no agency of their own. I can take, if people want to stay on a little longer, I was a little late, I can take some more questions if people want to ask.
Are the Ukrainians retaliating on the Russian side of the border at all? Putin seems to be a coward and he backs down. Maybe some, retaliation on that side might help to sort of end the war.
It's a really important question. The Americans and their NATO allies have extracted a promise from Ukraine that they will not attack on the other side of the border. The premise being that this would convince Russia that it was a war between NATO, i.e. with NATO weapons, and Russia. The Ukrainians have made the very valid point that, for example, if they were allowed to use HIMARS, these pinpoint accurate missile systems that the US has sent a few of, they could hit pinpoint the missile bases inside Russia that were firing missiles onto Ukrainian territory. The Americans have said no. Also, now that they have taken the city of Kherson in the south, if they move up a little more, parts of Crimea will be in missile range. The Ukrainians have asked for longer range missiles to go in the HIMARS system because they want to be able to hit pinpoint accurate the missile bases in Crimea, which is Ukrainian territory. The Americans recognize it as part of Ukraine, not part of Russia. The Ukrainians want to be able to hit those missile bases so that Russians can't fire from Crimea onto Ukraine. The Americans are refusing to give them those longer range munitions to go in the HIMARS. The longer range ones, called ATACMS, would let them fire 100 or more miles. Now they can only fire 50 miles, so they can't hit the bases in Crimea. It has become ridiculous because the Americans say they don't want Putin to escalate. Well, Putin is escalating with missiles that are destroying all of Ukraine's civilian infrastructure, electricity, water, heat, and so forth, schools, you name it. So this is one of the areas where the Americans are still stuck in thinking that I think is, I call it February think. It's thinking from the beginning of the war when US didn't want to escalate. But the Russians are escalating to beat the band. They're not using nukes because they know it's of no use to them, but they're doing whatever they can to destroy Ukraine. And it's foolish for us not to give these long-range missiles, which the Ukrainians would use in consultation with the US about the targets, which wouldn't kill civilians, but would show Russia that they are not immune. At present, Ukraine is fighting with one hand behind its back because the Russians can use their territory and occupied Ukrainian territory to shoot missiles at them. And the Ukrainians can't reach the furthest of those sites.
I agree. And I think it would be more effective than their fighting force, because I've been listening to programs which said that the Russian soldiers are not getting enough to eat. They're not getting uniforms. They just want to go home. So something like this would be much more effective.
No, absolutely. And the morale on the ground with Russian soldiers is horrible. And that's the strong point for Ukraine, because their morale, it's astonishing, given the pain and suffering. They've I mean, tens of thousands, maybe up to 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers are dead and wounded. Nobody knows what the figures are, probably much more for the Russians, but they've taken terrible losses of people who never intended to be in a war. That's another thing, Sandra. I mean, even when I was there in July, people would say to me, sometimes I keep pinching myself. I can't believe, even when I hear the missiles, that I'm really in a war. It's like us in Philadelphia or Scranton. Like, we couldn't believe it. If suddenly a missile was landing, on the State House or the City Hall. But the U.S. mentality keeps, the administration keeps falling behind the realities on the ground. I interviewed the defense minister, the Ukrainian defense minister, in July, and he talked about it. He said, if we'd had HIMARS 3 months ago, we'd be here. He said, I know we'll eventually get Patriots, but if we had them now, we could stop the Russians from destroying the country. So I can only hope that with all these meetings going on with NATO leaders and so forth, that the US finally gets it, that they have to give ATACMS, these long-range munitions for the HIMARS, to Ukraine now. But as of the moment, and no Patriots and no ATACMS are forthcoming.
Gee, I hope that things change. Thank you so much.
Write to your congressman. I mean, I actually feel there has to be an outpouring. And by the way, I asked the ambassador if they had a vetted list of charities to which Americans could contribute. Ukrainian American charities that are working with counterparts in Ukraine on rebuilding, on helping the military, on whatever. She said there is a list on the embassy's website. And, I'm going to look at it and print some of it on my column. But if any of you are interested in donating, go to the Ukrainian embassy website and you should be able to find good places to donate. And I would also recommend this group, whose people I have met with and seen what they've done in Ukraine. The group is called Ukraine Trust Chain, and you can find them online.
I just want to say that we are so fortunate to get this message from you that you got from your connections there. And when foreign affairs are on the table, you're there. And this one was the most sad, outstanding, message that we've gotten, and it is, I think it will make us want to help Ukraine through these foundations. So thank you so much.
Thank you.